either didn't mention at all or certainly didn't mention enough during his press conferences when he had the opportunity to send that message?
I think it would be unfair to criticise the PM on that particular issue. I mean, it would depend on if he'd been briefed, if there was something particularly we were trying to get across. There's obviously a lot of other issues at all similar times, and again, we'd expect it to be a more of a department-led issue. I think Priti Patel did press conferences from time to time herself, and again, Chris and Patrick would also reinforce some of those messages at different times, as well as the micro-targeting.
Looking back on it now, do you think more should have been said about this issue during the pandemic?
I think there's a range of issues that we could have gone into more detail and tried to be more targeted, but I think we did genuinely the best we could with a lot of those issues in hand, because there was a huge amount to communicate to so many groups. It was a challenge to get your arms around it all from number 10.
All right. I'm going to move on, Mr. Cain, although not too far in terms of themes, to talk about some of the parts of your statement where you refer to a lack of diversity amongst core decision makers and some of the consequences of that. So if we can go, please, to page 28 of your statement, at the very top. So it's 121D, the top paragraph. You refer there to your own initiative in pushing for the bubbles policy for families, to accommodate, if you like, families that had split and how they would deal with lockdown. And towards the end of that paragraph, you say that one of the challenges you face when you work on policy is the dynamic of the room, which in this case was white and middle-aged. They were doing their best, but without diversity, some policy decisions slip through the cracks. And do we take it that this particular one about split families was an issue that you felt was at least in danger of slipping through the cracks?
Yes, correct.
Let's go back, please, to the page before, because you refer there to another policy, or issue, the free school meals issue, at the bottom. And if we pick it up, the third line down, you say, you remember asking in the cabinet room of 20 people how many people had received free school meals. Nobody had, resulting in a policy and political blind spot. And you describe the government's resistance to Marcus Rashford's campaign as a huge blunder. Can you expand on that?
So I think, firstly, on the diversity point, I think, it's quite clear that there were challenges of gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and ethnic minority diversity at the very top of the PM's top team. And I think, as I say, this does have a challenge because people have their own lens through which they view problems through no fault of their own. It's just, a worldview or experiences that they've lived. But I think with the Marcus Rashford, it's a fantastic campaign. It was one that was obviously gaining a huge amount of media attention. But there was a view from the PM at the time that we were spending huge sums of money, and we needed to have a bit more restraint on public finances. Now, this was of course, it's sensible of him to start looking at public finances and look at where we could, develop slightly more rigid structures. But I said to him at the time, I don't think hungry children is the place to start, just from a, moral or political standpoint. It was the wrong decision. But I just think there was a lack of understanding of what families were potentially going through at that time, because, and this is solely just because I think people have never lived it. They don't appreciate it. They may not appreciate those challenges. So I think this was just one example of, of many where if you had more diversity in the room, and again, it's a range of diversity, I think it would improve decision making and improve policy making.
Can we look at a document on screen, please? 273901, page 164. I know you've seen a copy of this, Mr. Cain. This is a transcript of one of the notes that Patrick Vallance made during the pandemic. We can see it was in September 2020, and it relates to another issue, that perhaps is in a similar category. It's the issue of providing funding, financial support to those who are on low wages in order to make it financially viable for them to isolate. And we can see Patrick Vallance's record is CX, that means Chancellor, doesn't it?
Yes.
Chancellor blocking all notion of paying to get people to isolate, despite all the evidence that this will be needed. Let me ask you two questions in all. One is, were you aware of this resistance, perhaps a bit like the free school meals issue, to providing this funding? And secondly, is it, in your view, a similar point where an issue fell through the cracks because of a lack of diversity in the room?
I think it's difficult without knowing the full context of this, because it's not something I can fully remember from the time to look at, the reasons why the Chancellor may be blocking it could well be very valid on asking for more, evidence and data, to the costings and all of the such things you would expect from the Chancellor. The Chancellor, who I think we should also reflect, did bring in a furlough scheme that was, incredibly generous and, did provide, I think, for an awful lot of people. And of all the policies that we did at that time, the feedback I got from more than anyone else was of furlough and what a huge success that was. But on this particular issue, I don't remember in isolation.
Okay. Let me move on then. In fact, sticking with this time period, if we can look at the bottom of page 25 of your statement, please. We see the title, Coming Out of Lockdown, and so we're in the summer of 2020. And it's a paragraph 116. You describe a tension between some advisors, officials and ministers who wanted to take a slow, cautious approach, and others who wanted to unlock much more quickly and get back to how life had been before the pandemic had started. And this is a theme in this part of your statement, how those tensions worked out. In the following paragraphs, I won't take you to them, but you describe, is this right, that the more aggressive approach of unlocking quickly was one that was favoured by the right wing of the Conservative Party, and also in the printed media. The Telegraph is an example you give. Is that right?
Yes.
But you also say that your own research showed that the general public mood was actually more towards the cautious end of the spectrum, the opposite to the view held by, on your understanding, the Conservative Party. And this was all fed into that tension that you describe at the bottom of that page that we're looking at. Is that fair?
Yes.
And was this one of the factors which underpinned the Prime Minister's indecision later in 2020, September, October time, about whether or not to have a circuit break lockdown?
Yes, it was. I think the Prime Minister was torn in this issue. I think if he would have been in his previous role as a journalist, he would probably have been writing articles saying we should open up the beaches and, how we should, get ahead with getting back. And I think he felt torn where the evidence on one side and public opinion and scientific evidence was very much caution, slow. We're almost certainly going to have to do another suppression measure, so we need to have that in mind. To, media opinion and the bulk of, a certain rump of the Tory party was pushing him hard in the direction. So I think that was probably part of the reason for the oscillation, because, the rigid measures were very much against the sort of what's in his sort of political DNA, I guess.
In your statement, you refer to two schemes, two policies over the summer of that year, the back to work policy and the eat out to help out policy, which were both trying to send the, shall we say, business as normal message. You're very critical of both of those policies now. Were you critical of them at the time?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you said and who you said it to?
So I think, I and particularly the other communicators as well, we just found it very, very difficult, because a huge part of what our role and responsibility is at that point is what are we signalling to the public. There's a huge amount of focus that goes on, particularly in Westminster, which is, what is being said, as apart from, how things are being said, rather than, what it is you're trying to communicate. And at this point of developing policy, we are indicating to people that COVID's over, go back out, get back to work, crowd yourself onto trains, go into restaurants and enjoy pizzas with friends and family, really build up that social mixing. Now, that is fine if you are intent on never having to do suppression measures again. But from all of the evidence we were receiving, from all of the advice that we were receiving, it was incredibly clear we were certainly going to have to do suppression measures again. We knew that all the way through. That was the strategy from the start. So to then move forward and say, hey, we're going to get back into work when business wasn't even asking for business, for people to come back into work. In fact, they were encouraging their employees to stay at home still. We developed all of these tools for remote working, but it was government seemed to be on its own demanding people go to work when, the research we had was saying people, were still quite cautious. Business were feeding back they didn't want to do it. The scientific opinion was people didn't, that we were going to have another lockdown. So to me, it made absolutely no sense whatsoever why we were talking about getting everyone back to work, and that was the stories that ended up being on the front pages, which was a cause of great frustration.
We know that there were calls for a circuit breaker lockdown from September of that year. Were you a supporter of those calls at the time?
I was, yes.
We also know that that didn't happen, at least not in the first place, and that instead there were rules around tiering throughout the country, and Simon Case and Dominic Cummings. The inquiry has seen before. It starts with moronic. They don't understand what they're talking about. Mr. Case agrees, and you say this is embarrassing. Mr. Cummings says by the weekend he'll be saying 6 is untenable. The total disaster. We've got to get everyone back to work. Was that a reference, do you think, to the rule of 6, or it's not quite?
I think there was a discussion at the time we were going to do 2 households, a rule of 6. There was a sort of broad policy conversation, so I assume it's around those issues, yes.
Just reading down, we see references then to, in fact, Mr. Johnson did change his mind again rather sooner than perhaps had been anticipated. You say, what's his issue? Christmas cancelled stuff. Is this another emergence of the, I think your word was oscillation, but the indecision that we were discussing before the break?
Yes, and I think this point was what was probably these sort of months was when it was at its most pronounced, because he did not want to do any harder measures. He didn't want to go back into suppression, but I think most of the advisory team knew that was an inevitability. And I think the crucial thing was, I think you can forgive some of the errors in the first lockdown because things were moving at incredible speed. We were, the sort of building the train tracks as the train was moving in that first period, which meant it was, there was inevitably going to be mistakes. But I think we tried to learn as best we could. I think by the time we moved into this later period, I think the rump of number 10 felt that, okay, well, we've learned all these lessons from the first period of lockdown and repeat the exact same mistakes, which will be too slow to act, moving too late, and allowing the R to get more harmful to the economy, more harmful to health. more harmful to health outcomes. So I think, as you see this, there's a real frustration that we weren't just gripping things and putting in the lessons that we'd learned.
Frustrations which here you're sharing with Mr. Cummings and Mr. Case. Did you share them with Mr. Cain? We see a reference that you make, Joker, and Mr. Cummings says, yeah, and Mr. Cummings says, yeah, and line, as to whether Mr. Hancock and indeed other ministers should be losing their jobs.
I think there was probably more focus on the Health Secretary than others.
Between you and Mr. Cummings and Mr. Johnson on the 23rd of August, so a week or two before that WhatsApp that we were just looking at. And we can see it starting with Mr. Cummings saying he doesn't think it's sustainable for GW. Who would that be?
Gavin Williamson.
So it's not sustainable for Mr. Williamson to stay at the Department for Education. I think Lee needs to brief a reshuffle after his SR summer recess.
Spending review.
Spending review.
Imagine.
ASAP, get people in line, focus minds, and so on, talking about a reshuffle. He then repeats another message saying it's going to be turbulent, but we need a path through it. Then a message from Boris Johnson saying he agrees, but it will be fatal to brief the Cabinet about the upcoming reshuffle. And then a longer message from Dominic Cummings emphasising the position, and perhaps I'm going to ask you about this, giving us some clue as to the state of the government at the time. He says, it's a big mistake, not sustainable. If you don't get the Cabinet back into line, you'll have months more of the mayhem, briefing and leaking. This has seriously damaged your authority. You need to get this back. You need to read the Riot Act to the Cabinet and SW1. Should know there's a reshuffle coming between the spending review and Christmas. At the moment, the bubble thinks you've taken your eye off the ball. You're happy to have useless fuckpigs in charge. They think that a vast amount of the chaotic news on the front pages is coming from Number 10, when in fact it's coming from the Cabinet, who are feral, and so on. And then in the last paragraph, I also must stress, I think leaving Hancock in post is a big mistake. He's a proven liar who nobody believes or should believe on anything. And we face going into autumn crisis with the cunt still in charge of the NHS still. Therefore, we'll be back around that Cabinet table with him and Stevens bullshitting again in September. Hideous prospect. I'm going to come back to that, but let me just ask you about, or we'll go to one or two other of these messages. Just going on, there's a series of responses from Mr. Johnson talking about whether sacking people really solves things, quite what the timing of this reshuffle should be. And then if we can look at the top of page 40, please. You contribute. You say, problem leakers, Hancock, Grant, Wallace, Truss. There are other second-order ones, but these four have caused real problems this year. And then you say that you agree with the domestic policy agenda. We do need to up the firepower in key areas. Whenever we do a reshuffle, it should be bold and filled with those you're convinced will deliver for you. So two questions, Mr. Cain. The impression created is of a number of key cabinet ministers, whether because they're leakers or because Mr. Cummings has expressed such strong views about them, who weren't trusted as part of the government. Choose your adjective. Is it chaos? Is it dysfunction? Help us understand whether things were really as bad as are painted in these messages.
I think, it's obviously a time of significant stress, and, the challenges that we were dealing with are greater probably than any since, 1945, which should, it's important to highlight that context. I think government has a huge problem with leaking. I think, and it was really pronounced during COVID. You're having conversations, daily on potential options, and you would read about them in the next day in various newspapers. And that, I think, from a messaging point of view on public health, caused huge problems because people then want answers. Okay, what does this mean for me, my family, my lives? And you're then you haven't got a policy developed, and you're trying to sort of mop that up. And that was all the time. We couldn't have a single conversation. And I think that's because the sort of politics and the sort of knockabout view of sort of almost like politics as entertainment is now so entrenched in the relationship between the media and with the government. It's hard to stop it. And I think, it's something you deal with as part of politics during normal days. I think in a crisis like this, it was one of the most difficult issues we faced, was the constant leaking of stories.
Second question. Reading through it, of course, these are private exchanges, and we must remember that. But the language that is used repeatedly about colleagues is rude, it is dismissive, it is aggressive. We will hear evidence of a so-called macho culture in Downing Street at the time. Is this a fair reflection of the culture?
So first, I'd like to point out it's not my language or what I would have used. I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a problem within Mr. Johnson's sort of senior team, that there was a lack of diversity, and that was, I say, in gender, in socioeconomic, and in ethnic minority. And I think if you lack that diversity within a team, you create problems in decision making, policy development, and culture. So I think that's all part of the equation. But I think fundamentally, any number 10 is a direct reflection of the principle, and I think that's probably the case here.
Right. And finally, Mr. Cain, I want to just ask you one or two questions back on the question of the circuit breaker lockdown. And you describe in your statement, I won't take you to it, the meeting that happened on the 20th of September, where Professor Hennigan, Professor Gupta, and others were brought in virtually to Downing Street to discuss. And you, in your statement, make it clear that you regarded at that stage it as essential that a lockdown should take place, but that the Prime Minister disagreed and emphasised the economic arguments. At around this time, a few weeks later, I want to take you to INQ 267902, please. This is a text or WhatsApp between you and the Prime Minister. We'll see the 15th of October. He says, "I must say I've been slightly rocked by some of the data on COVID fatalities. The median age is 82 to 81 for men, 85 for women. That's above life expectancy, so get COVID and live longer. Hardly anyone under 60 goes into hospital. I no longer buy all this NHS overwhelmed stuff. Folks, I think we may need to recalibrate." And you say, all understood, but how does this change the policy? Still not politically viable to change course. He says it shows we don't go for nationwide lockdown. Now, previously we've talked about the economic arguments against lockdown. This seems to be introducing a slightly different theme. And I want to show you very briefly some other entries in Patrick Ballance's diaries from around this time. So could we look at them sequentially, please? First of all, it's 273901. First of all, page 150. So this was a little bit earlier in August, where Patrick Ballance has recorded that the PM WhatsApp group kicks off because the PM had read about the infection fatality rate. And it says this: "He's obsessed with older people accepting their fate and letting the young get on with life and the economy going." Quite a bonkers set of exchanges. If we can look at page 308, please. On a similar theme, picking it up a couple of lines down, PM says his party thinks the whole thing is pathetic and COVID is just nature's way of dealing with old people, and I'm not entirely sure I disagree with them. A lot of moderate people think it's a bit too much. And lastly, please, page 312. By this time we're in December. We see the chief whip says, I think we should let the old people get it and protect others. PM says, a lot of my backbenchers think that, and I must say, I agree with them. Now, the theme in those notes is similar, is it not, to that WhatsApp we looked at between you and the Prime Minister? It's not saying that the economy is the main argument. It's related, but it's different. It's saying, look, it's only old people who get this disease. Why don't we just let them get it so the young people can live their lives? Is that something which you think influenced the Prime Minister during this period?
I think you could see from the evidence he was I think he was concerned about the damage on society as a whole, and he was trying to view it through that lens. I think some of the language is obviously not what I would have used, but for me the core argument was always the same, which was your choice is that we lock down and control the virus, and we do so as quick as possible to minimise cost to health and cost to the economy at the same time. The only reason you can start having any of these conversations is if you have no intention of bringing in further suppression measures, which for me was always morally and politically, a non-starter. It was never something any responsible government or any responsible Prime Minister could or would undertake. So I felt a lot of this was just noise and distraction. And when reality became clearer, as it would, he would, and did actually take out the measures responsible. I think some of it is important to focus on. I think he acted too late on some of particularly the later lockdowns, but he did actually do what I believe to be the moral and responsible course of action. It was just later than it should have been.
Mr. Cain, thank you very much. Those are all my questions. Lady, there are, as you know, two sets of questions from core participants.
There are. Mr. Metzer.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Cain, I ask questions on behalf of the long COVID groups. I don't think we need to go to it, but if you need to, let me know. There's an email to the CSA and the CMO's office dated the 25th of June 2020 in which DHSC reported that the Cabinet Office had asked DHSC to look at communications around the recovery of patients following COVID-19 infection. Were you aware of this request for information about the recovery of patients following COVID-19?
I was not, no.
You say you weren't?
No.
Can you help as to whether there was any discussion in number 10 about communicating publicly the risk of long-term health impacts of COVID-19 at the time?
I think initially the understanding around long COVID was minimal. In number 10, I think we were still, gathering evidence for much of my time, which, obviously I left in the November of 2020. So during my time, I think we were still quite unclear on some of it, but it was becoming more pronounced. But I don't recall any specific campaigns to it at that point. I think, again, it would have been the sort of press conferences where we'd have discussed it. But I think at the time I was there, the evidence maybe wasn't as advanced as it, later became.
That's right through till November 2020, you say?
Yes.
I see. I might come back to that in a moment. Can we put up 283370, please? On the 5th of July 2020, NHS England announced your COVID recovery service, online rehabilitation service. And Sir Simon Stevens said the service would benefit, in quotes, and it's there, tens of thousands of people who are suffering long-term effects of coronavirus. You've said today that you met with the NHS regularly, even many times a week. In any of those regular meetings, was this announcement ever discussed?
Not that I recall, but you'll appreciate there was a huge number of meetings and issues raised, but I don't recall that now.
Okay. You've spoken today about individual responsibility, saying that people look to protect themselves in very sensible ways. Would you agree, Mr. Cain, that communications about the risks of the long-term effects of COVID-19 was important for the public to know so that they can protect themselves from this risk?
I think certainly once we understood what those dangers were, yes.
And do you agree that you were aware of that many months before you left office?
I was aware of conversations developing on long COVID and what it meant, but it was not a primary focus for my work, which was slightly different and more sort of political messaging space. This is the sort of thing that would have been led departmentally or by the NHS. I mean by that.
Yeah, but following those meetings with the NHS, are you aware as to whether there were any discussions in number 10 about raising awareness of the long-term effects of COVID-19 at the time of this announcement in July 2020?
I was not, but again, it would have been something that I would expect to be led departmentally or by the ALB.
But you agree, by that time, you were aware of the long-term effects risks?
To be honest, I can't remember the timings of when I would have been, up to speed with what the long-term risks of long COVID were.
Or at the very least, would you agree, you would certainly have been aware after the DHSC announcement on long COVID in October 2020?
Probably, but again, there was a huge amount taking place at that point. So again, it's as I say, it's not an area of focus that I particularly recall in any great detail, which I apologise for.
At paragraph 89, page 20 of your witness statement, you said at the beginning of the COVID response, vital public health messages were distributed via a mixture of Department of Health, Department of Transport or the Cabinet Office digital channels. Did the fact that different government departments were distributing public health advice result in inconsistent messaging?
So it's a good question. I think there is a general practice that a lot of government departments act as sort of communication fiefdoms in their own right, and that can sometimes make all sorts of messaging challenges, which is one of the things that we did in COVID, was to create a central campaigning body that reported directly in number 10 to try and pull together a coherency within our political campaigning, so we didn't have that sort of fighting. And I think it's something that's continued, thankfully, since I left.
But the existence of that fiefdoms, as you've put it, would you agree, did have a genuine risk of inconsistent messaging?
Well, I think we fixed that particular problem. I think that was something I was acutely aware of in part of the changes I wanted to make to the government communication system. So we did try and fix that with sort of command and control cabinet office centre that oversaw the campaigns as opposed to pushing them through. But that obviously came in sort of in the summer, I think, more in the sort of summer of 2020.
And what was that central campaigning body?
It's a group that's within the Cabinet Office that will consist of highly trained campaigning professionals who understand a lot of sort of newer media techniques. And the general thesis would be that departments themselves would have to pitch into that sort of central body to have campaigns they wanted to do green lighted, because the government spends hundreds of millions on campaigns, and 162 a year when I was there, most of which people don't notice. Metrics for measuring them are pretty poor, so we just wanted to professionalise that particular area.
So do you say through that central body there are attempts to coordinate public health messages communicated by different departments?
Correct.
How were public campaigns on COVID-19 updated by the government as information became available?
I think as policies change, we would try to make those amendments into our public communications.
I'm not sure you've answered the question. How were the campaigns updated?
Well, the policies, changes would be fed into the communications team. We would then look at, certain research, best ways to communicate them, and then make changes to, public announcements, to campaigns, whatever they were, as appropriate.
So who, if anyone, was ultimately responsible for communicating through government messaging that there was a risk of long COVID?
I think it would fall in between, the Department of Health and Alex Aitken within the Cabinet Office, would, or indeed the NHS. So there's the different areas would pick up different responsibilities. I'm not sure where the full responsibility would lie with that. It depends on the severity and how, I assume it would be in the Cabinet Office.
So I do read between that there's a danger it would fall between and not be dealt with by anyone.
I think, in the size and scale of government, that is indeed possible.
And the last question I want to ask you, Mr. Cain, is in the absence of a clear coordinated communications plan on long COVID, do you agree that number 10 and the Cabinet Office failed to alert the public sufficiently about the long-term effects of COVID-19?
I can only really comment during my own time, and I think part of the problem was just, developing the evidence stream. I think at the time, and the focus was on the live issue of dealing with the immediate response during my time. I think, I'm not sure how that subsequently changed as, I departed and the pandemic itself changed and our understanding changed.
Well, certainly, would you agree then, by the time, until you left in November 2020, as you've said, you would agree that there was a insufficient failure to alert the public about the long-term effects?
Again, from the evidence that we knew and had, I think we probably acted responsibly. But I think you can't communicate what you're unaware of, and I think in a lot of those early stages we weren't overly aware of the dangers. But I think we did discuss them. We did talk about them. They were raised within the press conferences. I think it was something that and those press conferences alone, we're looking at 10 million people watching every single evening, huge numbers. So these were issues that were raised.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Cain.
Thank you, Mr. Metzer. Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you. Mr. Cain, I'm going to ask you just about a couple of topics on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, which represents many bereaved families from across the UK. Both of the topics have been touched on by Mr. O'Connor, so I'll be I'll cut to the chase if I may. At paragraph 118 of your statement, you write this. At this time, and you're talking about 6 or 7 weeks into lockdown, the Prime Minister was becoming increasingly concerned about the impact of lockdowns on the economy and the political impact it was having on the right wing of the Conservative Party and the coverage of the right-leaning media. For example, on May the 8th, 2020, the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper that had been robustly anti-lockdown, printed its front page on a favourable interview with the leader of the opposition. The Prime Minister called me that evening and expressed significant concern, stating our policies were causing us to lose the backing of generally supportive elements of the media, and he felt they may well be right. And then you add in brackets, a position that conflicted with all the evidence available, those brackets. Yes?
Yes.
So just for clarity, what you are expressing there is a frustration that Mr. Johnson's prioritisation of media views, he was prioritising that over the actual evidence, over the views of advisors such as yourself, and over public opinion at that time. Is that right?
So I think it's slightly more complex in the sense that he, I think, was unsure about the policy that we were taking forward. So I think it was people reinforcing some of his own concerns. I think he probably would have, as I said before, been writing these sorts of leaders in the Telegraph himself. This isn't a criticism of the Telegraph, which is, shining a light on where they thought the issues were. But I think, the Prime Minister himself, this was part of his sort of oscillation and concerns
yes.
over policy development.
The point I'm trying to get you to clarify really is that the point in the brackets that you seem to need to make clear that it conflicted with all of the evidence. So he's preferring the views of the right wing of his party and the Daily Telegraph over the actual evidence and his advice. That's what you're conveying, isn't it?
That's correct.
The second topic, again, it's been touched upon, so I'll be brief, and it's about diversity. And Mr. O'Connor took you to deal with the lack of focus or consideration at all of split families and the Marcus Rashford issues. But you say in your statement, and again, I'm not going to put it up, but it's at paragraph 121D, that some policy decisions slip through the cracks due to this lack of diversity. And you've already referred to middle-aged and white people only in the room, and that's the problem. What other, apart from the ones you've already mentioned, what other policy decisions slip through the cracks because of this lack of diversity?
I think part of the problem is, I can't really sort of recall specifics off the top of my head, but I think part of the problem is just very much having a situation where people's own lived experience isn't in the room. So, if you have predominantly middle-aged white men, you're going to miss out on a whole load of different areas of expertise and lived experience that will, So again, like the Marcus Rashford was obviously a huge part of that. Some of the bubble sections, there'd be the sort of things that I would highlight.
Okay, so for example, the disproportionate effects of the pandemic on people from ethnic minorities, that's something that slipped through the cracks?
I think that was something that was discussed. I think that's part of the challenge. I think these issues will be discussed, but are they given the weight necessary without some of the lived experience? I think that, and that's I don't know the answer to some of that. Yeah. It felt to me that sometimes we missed things or didn't give enough attention that we could have done. But I genuinely don't know if how much that would have impacted.
Well, what steps, if any, were taken to address this diversity gap, which presumably was obvious at the time?
It's not, unfortunately for me, to pick the Prime Minister's senior team. I think, I can only control the elements of, the remit which I control, and I think we had a very diverse, particularly gender diverse, but we had a very diverse team within the Number 10 press office. And they were incredible individuals to work with. And
okay, but bearing in mind that diversity and the lack of diversity you've pointed up at paragraph 121D, did you advise the Prime Minister or anybody else that this was a problem that needed to be addressed?
I think it was something that was frequently raised. I think particularly by many female members of Number 10 who, I think it really sort of shone a light, because within COVID, what tends to happen is there was a small core room, often in the cabinet room, where the individuals would be around the table. Now, in non-COVID times, there'd be a lot more people in that room, so it would sort of mask some of these issues. During COVID, the sort of secondary cast, if you will, would be outside watching on a Zoom. And what became very clear is it was predominantly women in the building who were outside watching on a Zoom, and predominantly white middle-aged men around the table. So I would receive messages from members of my team sort of, highlighting this gender disparity and the fact that we needed to make change. And it was
so you advised, you advised about it, but did anything change? That was my question.
No, nothing did change.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cain. Thank you for your help. Just so people understand, we'll probably have a shortened lunch because I think we've overrun a little with Mr. Cain.
Thank you, my lady. That would be very helpful. So, my lady, the next witness is Dominic Cummings.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Cummings, could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Dominic Mackenzie Cummings.
Mr. Cummings, you have provided the inquiry with a lengthy witness statement dated the 12th of October, to which you have appended a declaration of truth. We take it, therefore, that the contents of your witness statement are true, and you've also helpfully provided us with a lengthy letter dated the 11th of November, in which you included a large number of screenshots of WhatsApps, texts, materials, and so on. Could we commence, please, with your career? The inquiry understands that from 2007 to 2014, you were a special advisor to Michael Gove MP. Is that correct?
Yes.
In October 2015, you became a director of the organisation Vote Leave, which culminated, of course, in the June 2016 referendum. And I think it's fair to say you were an architect in the successful Leave EU campaign.
Forgive me, sorry, our campaign was called Vote Leave. The other one was called Leave EU.
Thank you. On the 24th of July 2019, you became a senior advisor to the then Prime Minister. Is that correct?
Yep.
A general election was called relatively shortly thereafter. Did you, as is customary, resign as an advisor once Parliament had been dissolved, or did you stay in that post throughout the election campaign and then continue thereafter?
I'm afraid I can't remember the exact legal status that I had between the election being called and through the election. There are complicated rules. And also I had a slightly odd role in that time because I was neither in campaign headquarters nor was I full-time in Number 10. I was kind of in a separate room, and I continued doing some government work during that time, for example, with NATO and some national security things. I think there was a terrorist episode, floods, various things. So I was sort of hopping around between two different things.
All right. Mr. Cummings, I'm going to ask you, please, to remember that whilst you give evidence, it's essential that you try to keep your voice up and you speak as slowly as possible. That way, we may better understand your evidence. Did you play a part in the general election campaign, culminating in the 12th of December election?
Yes.
All right. I'd like to turn, please, to some of the government structures which form the large part of your witness statement and about which you express, I think, what may fairly be described as very trenchant views, starting with the Cabinet. You say in your statement that the Cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution in 2020. The combination of its size, the Prime Minister's inability to chair it, and its constant leaks meant it was seen by everyone in Number 10 as not a place for serious discussion. You go on to describe how those working in Number 10 see it as another problem to manage while real discussions happen elsewhere. The inquiry material shows that there were, although this may not be reflected in the minutes, frank and constructive debates held in Cabinet, as they say in diplomatic circles, and that there were important decisions made in Cabinet and important matters debated. Is that a fair summary, therefore, of the role of Cabinet during the coronavirus crisis?
I think it depends, to some extent, it depends what you mean by the word decision. I mean, formally, a lot of things are decided in Cabinet. Obviously, that's the formal constitutional structure. But very rarely is that actually a reflection of the reality of how the, quote, decision, unquote, is actually being made.
So is it more of a reflection of the fact that important decisions started to become taken elsewhere, predominantly in number 10?
I wouldn't say it started to be. I think that was the case in 2019. And of course, it's been a feature for many decades of this trend increasing.
If we may call that process a sidelining of Cabinet, did you contribute to that process, do you think?
I would say more that I just managed it as a sort of like the weather. I mean, it was just a sort of fact of life. It was a combination of the constitutional crisis in 2019, the Prime Minister's own personal temperament, habits that had grown up in the Cabinet Office over many years, going back a long period. I actually said to the Prime Minister...
Slow down, Mr Cummings, please, slow down. I said to the Prime Minister...
I suggested to the Prime Minister, both in the last week of the election campaign in 2019 and in the first week of January, when we discussed the future generally, that he should strongly consider A, a major reshuffle, and B, radically shrinking the size of the Cabinet back to where it was something like 100 or so years ago. Because as anyone who knows who has dealt with very large organisations, it's impossible to have serious conversations with 25, 30 people around a table like that. The Prime Minister did not want to.
Due in large part to your own WhatsApps, Mr Cummings, we're going to have to coarsen our language somewhat.
I apologise.
You called ministers useless fuckpigs, morons, cunts, in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues. Do you think you contributed to a lack of effectiveness on the part of ministers and of the Cabinet?
No, I think I was reflecting a widespread view amongst competent people at the centre of power at the time about the calibre of a lot of senior people who are dealing with this crisis extremely badly.
Slow down, please, Mr Cummings. Are you suggesting that your views expressed in those revolting ways were shared by others?
Well, my appalling language is obviously my own, but my judgment of a lot of senior people was widespread.
Do you feel that you expressed your views too trenchantly, that your opinion of ministers and of the Cabinet overstated the position?
No, I would say, if anything, it understated the position, as events showed in 2020.
Cabinet meetings appear, according to your statement and the material that we've seen, to have been, to some extent, scripted. But insofar as Cabinet committee meetings were concerned, they were very largely scripted. Ministers were given scripts to read out. Bullet points were written by officials who had exchanged them in advance. And the conclusions were largely scripted in advance. Is that a fair summary of Cabinet committee meetings?
It is. Obviously not always, and obviously there are exceptions, and there are some people who chaired Cabinet committee meetings who did an extremely good job. So I'm not claiming that this is universal. I'm saying that it was a general feature, and it was much more often true than not.
You refer in your statement to Cabinet and Cabinet committee meetings being Potemkin meetings. What did you mean by that?
They were Potemkin in the sense that they were for show, as part of the sort of show of the Constitution. That, unfortunately, a large part of how the system works is that ministers parade up Downing Street, the cameras click, people act like Cabinet is actually deciding things, but everyone behind the number 10 door, actually near power, knows that that's very rarely actually what's going on. That usually what's happening is that senior officials have actually decided what's happening, and the ministerial performance is often / usually a performance. Of course, that changes according to historical situations and crises, and sometimes cabinet, even in 2019, 2020, became genuinely important. But I'm just trying to give a general picture.
On the cusp of the coronavirus pandemic, where was power exercised? Where was the effective decision making?
By cusp, where do you mean, sorry?
January, February.
Well, it certainly wasn't in cabinet.
Where was it?
Well, most power really is nominally in the hands of the Prime Minister and to a very large extent in the hands of the Cabinet Office. I would say the Cabinet Secretary is something like 10 times or 100 times more powerful than anybody else in the Cabinet apart from the Prime Minister. All sorts of elements of real power actually now in our system answer to him, but a large part of the performance and the media coverage is aimed at trying to cover up this fact and to try and portray the ministers as actually in charge.
Over time, you recommended and you brought into effect two very important meetings, or two important processes. One was the 8:15 officials meeting, at which you and other officials discussed the day's events, resolved to raise important matters that needed to be debated. And then at 9:15 daily, there became meetings with the Prime Minister in his study or in the cabinet room. Where did that take place?
The sort of formal part of it was in the, the 8:15 was in the cabinet room every day. The 9:15 was usually also in the cabinet room. Sometimes that would be preceded by a smaller meeting in the Prime Minister's study, which adjoins the cabinet room through a kind of joint door.
Were your 8:15 officials meetings minuted or noted?
I'm not sure exactly what the process changed. Obviously, the 8:15 and 9:15 meetings I originally created out of the kind of air of disaster, and they were very informal, but they went through different iterations. So they became called different things, the 8:15 and the 9:15. I think there was at least 3 different formal iterations, and the bureaucratic processes will have been different for each one. I think right at the very beginning, at 8:15, there were kind of action points taken because it was very much an action-oriented thing. It wasn't any kind of formal structure. So I would guess that there were not formal minutes at those meetings to begin with, but there were certainly action points that Imran, the Private Secretary, and others would write live during the meeting and then circulate immediately afterwards.
By and large, as you say in your statement, there was little transparency or visibility. Traces of discussions might only be in an email or WhatsApp if they exist at all. Is that correct?
I think it's certainly correct about the very first part, as I said, when we just created the meetings, because they had no kind of formal position of any kind, though I don't think that's accurate about later on.
The Cabinet Office, to which you've referred, you describe in this way, that it had more sand in the petrol tank rather than the Rolls-Royce gearbox, or gearbox it is often described as. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you speak to many people who've knocked around the system for a very long time, the Cabinet Office over a long period of time has accumulated more and more power, formal and informal. It's become incredibly bloated. It's acquired huge numbers of people, huge numbers of teams, and particularly on the sort of deep state, national security side, crisis management has become in all sorts of ways extremely opaque and effectively completely invisible to any political figure, including the Prime Minister. So it was extremely difficult to know in number 10 who exactly in the Cabinet Office was doing what, whose responsibility it was, who were we supposed to talk to get action, and that was critical in particularly in the first couple of months.
Was this a function of staffing levels, inadequate staffing levels, or over-staffing, or in particular parts of the Cabinet Office, or a reflection of the personalities, the people who were actually in the Cabinet Office?
I think it was a mix, like all dysfunctional systems. It was a mix of a lot of the wrong people in the wrong job, decades of accumulated power, no real scrutiny and insight, a culture of constantly classifying everything to hide mistakes and hide scrutiny. Management was bad, incredibly bloated, with so many senior figures that they themselves, as Helen McNamara's statement makes clear, the senior people themselves didn't know who on earth was in charge of what.
In your statement to the inquiry, you say that in 2020, a handful of senior officials were the wrong people for the posts. And this is in the context of your views on government generally, so not just the Cabinet Office, but number 10. This meant they were unable to replace other people who were wrong for their posts. However, it's the Prime Minister who is responsible for the wrong people remaining in crucial jobs. Were, in your opinion, the wrong people in those crucial jobs in the Cabinet Office?
Yes, I think that there clearly were some people in the Cabinet Office who were in the wrong jobs. The Cabinet Secretary and I had quite a few frank discussions about some of these problems going back into 2019. He actually removed some of the people at my request and moved them on to other things, though, of course, Whitehall being Whitehall, they were often promoted rather than actually removed. So, yes, there were, I agree with the thrust of your question.
Who else did you have in mind by that observation, that there were the wrong people in those jobs?
Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary at the time himself said to me that he had never sought that job. And he had serious doubts about the wisdom of combining the Cabinet Secretary's job and the National Security Advisor job. I think that was correct. Mark was a very able diplomat. He had enormous skills in all sorts of ways. But the way in which the Cabinet Office has evolved. So, if we take it.
Well, perhaps we'll pause there. We'll just stay on the issue of the Cabinet Secretary.
Okay.
That Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwell, now Lord Sedwell, whom you've described as a talented and able diplomat in all sorts of ways, you denigrated and insulted by your WhatsApps and text messages, did you not?
I guess so. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but it's certainly the case that I came to the view that he did not have visibility of the fundamental disasters that were unfolding inside the Cabinet Office.
You used obscenities to describe him, and then in a series of texts and WhatsApps you said he was off the pace. His staff knew he was off the pace. He was unable, essentially, to function at all as the head of the Cabinet Office.
I don't think I actually said that he was unable to function at all, but the rest of what you said is correct. And this was not just my view. Part of what I was expressing to the Prime Minister was that other people in the Cabinet Office and crucial people in officials, not political people, in the Prime Minister's office had said to me, we fear that both the Cabinet Office has gone dreadfully wrong and that Mark doesn't understand just how badly wrong this has all gone.
You were unimpressed by the Principal Private Secretary. You believed that he deferred too much to the Prime Minister. He didn't force him to face up to hard choices. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that one of the that role is highly underrated, I think, in understanding how government really works. It's an extraordinarily powerful position in all sorts of ways. Again, much more powerful really than anybody in the Cabinet apart from the Prime Minister. It's a critical role. My view was that a role like that in a country like ours should be filled by one of the absolutely most able people that we can possibly muster in our country. And I made that argument to the Prime Minister before January, during the election, actually, about making a change in January. I lost the argument.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings. Slow down. You lost that argument.
I lost the argument. I made it again after the first wave, and I lost the argument again.
Your views on the Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care are very well known, and we'll be looking at some of your remarks about him in due course. But overall, the tenor of your statement, it's the effect, and this is to use your words, that senior ministers, senior officials, and senior advisors like yourself fell disastrously short of the standards that the public had to expect. Is that a view you adhere to still?
It is. I also think there were many exceptional people, as I've tried to also explain in my statement, but they were all enmeshed in a fundamentally dysfunctional structure, and that meant that even the great people were often unable to do great work.
You also say that it is completely crackers that someone like you should have been in number 10. Is that a view you still maintain?
For sure.
Ultimately, who bears the responsibility, Mr. Cummings, for appointing the individuals whom you have described in these terms?
Well, lots of them obviously were appointed. Lots of the critical cabinet office roles were appointed before me and the Prime Minister arrived. The Prime Minister obviously bears responsibility for the Cabinet. He appointed the Cabinet in summer 2019. Contrary to all the media reports, I had zero involvement with that. I tried to get him to change it in January and failed. Tried to get him to change it in February and almost completely failed.
Who appointed you, Mr. Cummings?
Prime Minister.
The inquiry has heard evidence that the Cabinet Office plays a vital role in government as the coordinating centre. It liaises with other government departments, it brokers issues, it resolves debates and issues between line departments. It is the hub of government. On your arrival in Downing Street in July of 2019, did you believe that the Cabinet Office was effectively performing that role?
No.
The Cabinet Secretary, the inquiry has been told, has an equally important function of exercising such institutional levers as may be required in order to make other parts of government work. Were those institutional levers being effectively operated by the Cabinet Secretary when you arrived in Downing Street in July 2019?
No, but I would also, obviously, it was the middle of the worst constitutional crisis in a century, and I certainly would be extremely unfair to blame the Cabinet Secretary for all the problems that we had at that time.
Throughout the rest of that year and at the beginning of 2020, did you discern any improvement in the structural system concerning the Cabinet Office?
In some ways, yes, I think it did improve. On the very first day that I arrived, I sent an email to the Cabinet Secretary regarding how I thought that Brexit should work in terms of the Brexit, what became known as XS, Brexit Strategy and Brexit Operations, XO. The Cabinet Secretary agreed with me. We set that up. I think almost everybody involved with the process thinks that it radically improved how the government dealt with such an extremely complicated question. And I think also everybody that I know who I spoke to about it thinks that, contrary to the impression that one often gets in the media, in fact, going through that admittedly nightmarish process of XO during 2019 actually proved extremely useful in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis. So overall, I would say, I did say to the Prime Minister in December 2019 as the election was ending, overall the system is completely dysfunctional. But within that, the Cabinet Secretary did make various important improvements, I think.
Do you think your description of your colleagues, the way in which you described them, their functions, their abilities, their talents, added to that dysfunctionality?
No, I think the opposite. I think my job, a huge part of the problem of the culture of Westminster and Whitehall that was so disastrous in COVID is people not speaking out about core problems. And I regarded my job as, I'm not a very smart person, I'm not a specialist in all sorts of ways, but I had built very effective teams. And I felt that a crucial part of my job was to say to the PM and to other people, if I thought that someone couldn't do the job, then to make that clear, because A, that's so fundamental to performance, and B, the issue is so often buried in Whitehall.
On the 3rd of May, so after the initial crisis and the first wave,
3rd of what, sorry?
3rd of May 2020, INQ 253940, you sent an email to Martin Reynolds, the Principal Private Secretary, Stuart Glasborough, Claire Brunton, Imran Shafi, the Private Secretary for Health Matters, Education and other policies, Hannah Young and Emily Benyon, as well as Munir Mirza, and you copied it back to yourself. You said, we're wasting far too much time in crap meetings. We're not using the PM's time well. Changes from tomorrow. No papers go to PM on anything related to COVID-19, including from Cabinet Office and HMT, unless they're cleared by Shinner, that's Tom Shinner?
Yes.
Or me, nobody else. Any chair brief and anything related to COVID-19 must be cleared by Shinner or me, nobody else. And then there are some further directions concerning papers for prime ministerial meetings. Shinner, hire whoever else you think you need. 5, we must start cancelling meetings and telling the PM. And so on.
Mm-hmm.
Did that direction that nothing would go to the Prime Minister on COVID from the Cabinet Office and HMT include anything from the Cabinet Secretary?
You mean, did that mean that the Cabinet Secretary could not write directly to the Prime Minister?
Unless cleared by you or Tom Shinner?
No.
So who was being excluded, in effect, within the civil service from communicating papers to the Prime Minister without your intervention?
So essentially what I was trying to do here, the actually quote, or me, unquote, is actually not really very relevant. What I was actually trying to do was empower Tom Shinner, who is an excellent official. We had a fundamental problem, we had many fundamental problems. Two most obvious ones were the Cabinet Office was a bomb site, and we had a huge problem of quality control of documents going into meetings, and inconsistent data, inconsistent facts being read out. And many officials had come to me and said, this is causing chaos. There has to be some a formalised system to actually grip this, because the Cabinet Office was a dumpster fire and Shinner was extremely able. Essentially what I was trying to do here was say, there has to be someone who actually takes responsibility for saying that they and a team have checked the information and are certifying that it's accurate, so that we would get away from these nightmare meetings that we'd had all the way through the previous few weeks, of documents coming up, people then saying this is wrong, this is out of date, everyone looking at each other like the Spider-Man meme, not being clear who's actually responsible. So I was trying to say, let's actually establish a proper structure for this with someone who everybody respected.
Tom Shinner was, like you, an advisor with the civil service to the Prime Minister.
With respect, he was not really like me, no. He was
an advisor insofar as he was not a member of the civil service. He was an advisor to the Prime Minister.
No, with respect, that's not correct.
What was he?
He had been an official. He then left. He then came back in as an official. I think he was, well, to begin with, his exact status was slightly unclear, obviously, for the first few days, because he arrived on the 16th of March.
Did you bring him in?
He was a civil servant, not an advisor.
Did you bring him in, Mr. Cummings?
I did.
Was it wise, in hindsight, to concentrate this degree of control in yourself and Mr. Shinner?
I think bringing Tom in and empowering him the way I did was one of the single, probably handful of best decisions I made in the whole nightmare. And by the way, the Cabinet Secretary strongly agreed with me. I think he'd worked with Tom Shinner on a lot of Brexit issues and with Jeremy Hayward a few years earlier. So it wasn't like I was imposing this on them. I actually spoke to Mark and said, here's my idea. Are you happy with it? And he said, yeah, it sounds great, sounds great.
On the 15th of May, according to your statement, you had a long discussion with the private office in Downing Street to review what had gone wrong with the Cabinet Office. You raised issues about lack of coordination across Whitehall, the duplication of requests, in essence, a failure to grip whatever issues or problems confronted the Cabinet Office. What was your view of the private office within Downing Street with whom you were having those conversations?
I think the private office, as I made clear in my statement, was in all sorts of ways absolutely excellent, and I think it had some of the finest public servants in the whole system. I think the country was lucky to have them. I think, though, that there was, I would say that there was one very obvious problem, which was that apart from the leadership of the private office, he was a notable exception. But there was a core problem, which is that private secretaries in the Prime Minister's office are generally quite junior officials. Quite a few of them are young women. And at that meeting on the 15th of May and on other occasions, some of the young women in the private office said to me that they thought that there was a serious problem with senior people in the Cabinet Office not paying attention to what they were saying, talking over them, generally just a bad culture of a lot of the senior male leadership in the Cabinet Office, which was something which I agreed with.
Well, we'll be looking in due course at some of your emails and texts to other members of the team. Is it fair to say that you were critical also of the private office, that you sent emails and texts saying the private office is systemically flawed in certain regards, as well as the Cabinet Office?
So I think it's two separate things. I was generally highly impressed by the private secretaries in the private office, who I thought did an absolutely extraordinary job. But I thought that the overall structure in which the private office operated clearly didn't work. And you had a relatively tiny number of people with, as I say, relatively junior people suddenly being completely swamped by being asked to solve huge numbers of problems from all across the system. So when I say the private office didn't work, it wasn't that this is not a criticism of most of the people in it. It's that it was swamped by the broader dysfunction of the Cabinet Office.
Could we have, please, the letter that you sent to the inquiry, 48313 at page 56. This, I think, is if we go back to the previous page, thank you very much, we can see this as an email you sent on Monday, the 13th of July, right at the bottom of the page. It's a lengthy email, isn't it, Mr. Cummings, in which you set out your views on a number of different parts of the government machine.
Yes.
There had been for some time, you'd raised the issue in January of the overall structure of the government. You'd raised it again in May. You had repeatedly returned to this subject, and you returned to it in July. Over the page, on page 57, there are references to the Cabinet Office not working for anyone in the second paragraph.
Yeah.
Further down the page, you are critical, it's about halfway down, of COBRA and CCS. Is CCS the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and how it failed in multiple ways?
Yeah.
You are critical of the data system, correct?
Yeah.
Over the page, page 59, you are critical of institutional friction, turf wars, the existence of blame games. Page 60, you refer to bloating, a copylist culture. 61, we've experienced disaster, the PM has said sorted out. We're still a low-performing entity while dealing with the next phase of COVID and economic horror. we need a timetable for key actions. Simon and Tom should informally scout out possible key people for this now. Was there any part of the government machine, Mr. Cummings, in which you did not find fault?
Well, in summer 2020, I spent quite a lot of time talking to British Special Forces, and I found that they were exceptional.
Well, now, Mr. Cummings, you know perfectly well that this is evidence directed at the coronavirus pandemic, and we are debating the mechanics of number 10, the Cabinet Office, and the government response.
They were isolated. So if you're asking purely about the number 10 and Cabinet Office system...
I'm talking about the structure concerned with the response to the coronavirus pandemic.
So I would say overall, widespread failure, but pockets of excellent people and pockets of excellent teams doing excellent work within an overall dysfunctional system.
In your statement, you describe how, following this email, that the Prime Minister, whilst initially agreeing with the sentiment of your trenchant views on aspects of the government machine, listened to use your word, pop-ins, and then got cold feet. What are pop-ins?
So obviously the context for this document is that comes after 8 weeks of a nightmare situation kicked off by the PM.
I do apologise, Mr. Cummings. What are pop-ins?
Pop-ins are what people in private office refer to when the Prime Minister would make a decision about something. Some element of the system, often in the Cabinet Office, would not like what had been agreed. And in the best Sir Humphrey Westminster style, they would wait for me and other people to not be around the Prime Minister, and they would pop in to see the Prime Minister and say, "Dear Prime Minister, I think that this decision really wasn't the best idea. Very brave Prime Minister. Perhaps you should trolley on it." And this was a general problem.
You should trolley on it. Meaning?
Well, I'm just using the sort of generic term that we often used about the PM.
The term you used and his Cabinet Secretary used and his Director of Communications used and other officials, no doubt, about his propensity to...
Pretty much everyone called him the trolley, yeah.
...change direction. Cobra...
If you're moving on, Mr Keith, I appreciate that it's a little early, but I think we've had quite a long stint for...
Yes, indeed.
And Mr Cummings, like me, does speak very quickly. So I think we'll take a break now. I shall return at 1:45.
Thank you.
All right.